Okay, the next demo we want to talk about here is the JSP capabilities that are built into this project. So go ahead.
Yeah, so JSP, this one does warrant a little bit of background and explanation as to why I would do this. So a lot of people may be familiar with JSP as more or less one of the ways IBM threatened to destroy Domino during the early 2000s. It's a very old technology. If you use JSP in 1997, it's still JSP. And so it is essentially, at its core, what it is a page output language, like a templating engine, if you want to sound fancy about it. And it's similar to things like PHP on one hand, or something like Handlebars or Mustache, and some newer ones, Time Leaf, things like that, where it's meant to be you write the HTML and then you have some hooks back to code, and then that's it dynamically generates the page. Now, this will probably sound a lot like XPages because that's what XPages is. So XPages is based on JSF, which in turn is kind of a souped up version of JSP. So JSP is the first one from the Java EE stack. JSF is the next one. JSF added the kind of server persistence, partial refresh, the component-based development where it's all really like a series of Java classes on the server side. And so JSP is older, more elemental, we'll say. But there are a couple reasons that I've added in here beyond the core reason of because I could. The other reasons are that it supports some later things that we'll talk about, but even on its own, it's actually a very pleasant development experience for certain types of apps. So I frequently refer back to my blog as kind of a prototypical example of this because my blog is written using JSP, because for that kind of application, it doesn't have a server resident, like a page when you're viewing a blog entry does not have a server component for the thing you're looking at. Like the server's done. It sent you the blog post. And so in that kind of like one pass, here you go, I just want to write a page. This is perfect because I don't have to worry about managing view state. I don't have to worry about number of open views. Like again, XPages can handle that. You can say no state on the server. You can increase the number of views. You can manage all these things. But for certain tasks, this is absolutely perfect. And additionally, hypothetically, somebody might have some old JSP tags around. So this would support things like JSTL, if you're familiar with that. That's the standard tag library. And it has those things. And so, you might just have it might just be familiar with that. But the reason I kind of like it on its own is that it's just a nice environment. So here I've added the ability to, if you have hello.jsp, this is classic JSP. So this is written, it looks a lot like XPages, where you'll have the same kind of expression language format. So it has the $1. It doesn't have pound bracket because it has no runtime binding. It's all once and done. So there is no concept of this will be reevaluated. You can reload the whole page, or that's it. It has these kind of, the equivalent of custom controls, as they're referred to as tags in JSP, but they're the same idea. And one thing you'll note is that here I'm writing the entire page. So there is nothing implicit in JSP's rendering. If you have a JSP file that is just the word hello, you will get just hello as your HTML output. There's nothing, it doesn't give you anything that you don't put into it, which it also has utility. Like sometimes you don't want all of this stuff. Like you don't want, for example, the framework's chosen JavaScript libraries, which is often a sticking point with XPages in particular. There is no JavaScript library here. If you want to bring one in, you bring it in, and you can handle that. And so you don't have any, you could call it cruft coming in other than the stuff that you put in there. This isn't for every application. I would say there are probably very few XPages applications that you would want to move to JSP. The ways that this will come in is with a different spec down the line, but having this here is interesting kind of on its own. I expect I will use this in a couple places because it is just pleasant. Like there's also just kind of like it feels good for the programmer's soul to have something like a little closer to the metal. Like obviously it's still client server stuff going through and it's all this Java that's going into it, but it's like, it feels nice. It feels refreshing to just have something simpler, quick, agile. It's just like you're writing the HTML directly. That feels nice. That doesn't necessarily pay the bills, but it's something. but really this is primarily a support structure for something else. But even on its own, this is a nice, it's nice to have, and it's a nice way to write pages. And so if you have a case where you are primarily writing, for scalability purposes, or just because that's the nature of what you're doing, you now have this ability to do JSP pages within the NSF as an alternative to XPages. So it ends up pretty nice. I'm not advocating that everybody use it for everything, but it is here.
So go back to the demo page there. The URL is pointing directly to this JSP?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Which was actually an interesting thing about the XPages stack. The way I was able to do this, because the way the XPages runtime usually works is that it looks for XSP in the URL, either as .xsp or /XSP/something. But years and years ago, I think for social edition reasons, they added the ability to say, add additional handled extensions. So you could tell the runtime, handle X, Y, or Z other extensions. So I said handle JSP, and then it calls my code to handle that. So I don't have to include an XSP in the URL. Nice. So it still does need to be an extension. Like I think it looks for the dot in there. So you can't make really nice URLs out of that, but you can add custom supported content types. So I think they did that for like iWidget, something or other. But if you have other extension-based content types, you can do that and make slightly nicer URLs.
So the examples that you've got there, so my request scope is, right? So your example is literally just loading a JSP page. So the trick here is that the project itself is adding the ability to recognize those variables. Is that, am I wrong there?
So what's going on in the JSP is that it processes these, and it uses the new expression language that was added. So it uses the same EL4 that was added for XPages. It uses the same CDI beans, and then it also uses, like, you have FN here. This is a JSTL function that is a standardized thing where I'm just, escape XMLs, because you want to escape your output. You don't want to just emit that. And so you have these things, but you do have all of the capabilities of full expression language and your beans, so function calling, all of that stuff that comes along with it. You also have mechanisms in JSTL for iterating over things. So for example, if I go here, you see C4H, this is equivalent to XP repeat, that sort of thing. And so it is a full-on page description language, and it's actually quite capable, and it has a lot of niceties and a lot of things that are very, very similar to what you would have in XPages for good reason. Some of the things in XPages are derived from the things from JSP. But it is that full-on thing. Like, these examples are quite, bare bones and simple, because I'm essentially writing these to make sure it loads. But beyond that, like, it is a full-on app, templating environment that has a lot of great capabilities. You can also, if you were so inclined, just like, if you learned JSP back in the 90s or early 2000s, all the examples would have you writing Java code on the JSP page. Don't do that. You still could. Don't. Just do not do that, even though technically you are able to do that, and technically that is the original way. So like older JSPs will be written, so instead of the for each tag, you would write a for loop in Java and then emit the stuff in between. That'll still work. I don't recommend it, but that'll still work. And it does have, there's other components. Like, I found with JSP, the best thing to do is to just look at what's the newest, cleanest way to do things, and then ignore the 25 or so years of stuff that happened before, where it's an old language. It has very questionable decisions, but on its own, just as a way to start with, here's a request coming in and I want to get HTML, it's very clean. So it has that going for it.
And the point of this video series is to talk about how we can modernize the ways of doing these things. So There's another example. And of course, this is all your project page on OpenNTF has got links to all the juicy documentation on how to take advantage of this.
Exactly. Well, that's one of the nice things about both the code behind all these specs and the documentation, is that I could just link to the Jakarta EE stuff, and like I can bring in their code that I didn't have to write, and I can link to their documentation that I didn't have to write. So there you go.